Hi everyone, and welcome to week 5. I want to touch on a subject related to what we'll be doing in class this week, and that subject is, how do I know my newsletter is effective? In class this week, we'll start out with a number of different lectures, getting started with Microsoft Publisher, creating our first publication, and working with text. Then in discussion, we'll go out and review and share some local newsletters. And then finally, in our activities, we'll create our own newsletter. So by the end of the week, you'll be able to send your newsletter out into the world, beautifully formatted, nicely documented. But let's ask the essential question. How do I know that that newsletter that I send out into the world is really effective? And in order to do that, we have to think about how we measure that effectiveness. I went out to the virtual library and found a fantastic study, The Impacts of Parenting Newsletters on Fathers of Kindergarten Children. They walk through the process of creating a newsletter, and this was specifically targeted at fathers and father figures of kindergarten school-aged children at a specific local school. They distributed this newsletter weekly for 6 weeks, and then tracked this or followed up on this with a self-reported questionnaire. The essential question of this study was, can directly reaching out to fathers and father figures using a newsletter bridge that divide between men and parenting education programs? And with that newsletter, is that an effective alternative to traditional parent education programs? And the study went on to break it down further into topical questions like these. How does one effectively use a newsletter as an education tool? Do parents actually read the newsletter they receive? And does simply reading that actually impact knowledge, skills, and behavior? I'll jump right to the conclusions here. And they concluded that reaching out directly to fathers with a newsletter can bridge that divide between men and parenting education programs, and that this does provide an effective alternative to traditional education programs. Although I jumped right to the conclusion here, I would encourage each of you who's interested in either this subject or their approach of creating a newsletter, distributing it, and then tracking the results, to reach out to our virtual library. And that brings us right back here into our classroom with our Week 5 activity to create a one-page holiday, personal, or family newsletter. Some of you will approach this project by focusing in on the gears, the mechanisms of using Microsoft Publisher to actually create the newsletter. But I want each of my students to stand out above the crowd and think at a higher, a bigger picture level. So although you'll certainly focus in on creating that newsletter, think about how you might distribute that. We have some examples in our discussion this week. And then how you might track that and the effectiveness of your newsletter. And when it comes to tracking, you'll have to think of your own essential question and topical questions that relate to your newsletter. I'm really interested in seeing that. So as you submit this activity, please consider submitting the essential and topical questions associated with your newsletter. I'd be really interested to read those. Thank you all for your time, and if you have any questions this week, email me directly or post them up in any one of our discussion forums. Thank you all.